plenty of reasons to mock World Championship Wrestling. Stupid gimmicks, asinine booking decisions, intelligence-insulting storylines. You name it, the lads and lasses, but mostly lads in Atlanta, Georgia, did it. But for all its faults, there is no denying that WCW could play host to some of the finest professional wrestling matches, not just in the United States, but anywhere in the world. Because for all the boneheaded backstage blunders that helped contribute to its demise, while WCW was alive and kicking, they were often the place to see the best wrestlers go at it. So why not celebrate that, rather than, say, making more of the same tired Vince Russo jokes? Bro. Now, for this here video, I should stress that we are not ranking these bad boys in order. Also, we've tried where possible to limit the number of times the same match crops up. So yes, we do know that Sting and Vader had banger after banger against one another, but for variety's sake, we are not going to be including every match they had together. And as a little Michael Hayes, P.S. get it, to add, we are classing WCW as everything that came after Jim Crockett sold his promotion to Ted Turner in the fall of 1988. With all that now being said, it's time to sit back, get your VHS tapes out the loft, pop a top on a can of Surge and put your big boy away while watching some straight hot fire from the place where the big boys played. I'm Adam Pacitti from Cultaholic Wrestling, and these are 50 WCW matches everyone should watch at least once. Join us! Number 50, Vader vs. Ric Flair at Starrcade 1993. The main event of the 10th anniversary of Starrcade offered up a unique clash of styles and personalities. The show was supposed to be headlined by Vader defending his World Heavyweight title against Sid Vicious, but the master and ruler of the world got a little scissor happy during a tour of the UK and was let go. It's fair to say that Nature Boy was a serious upgrade, and Flair putting his career on the line in his pursuit of his 11th title triumph only added to the drama. The Charlotte, North Carolina crowd was solidly behind the hometown hero, who had a daunting task in trying to withstand the ferocious, relentless onslaught of the champ. Indeed, Vader spent much of the contest pummeling the challenger, who just about managed to weather the storm, avoiding a moonsault and a top rope diving headbutt from Vader's manager Harley Race before hitting a last gasp chop block and just barely getting the super heavyweight shoulders down for a 3 count. It was the end of a long, physical and emotional match that more than deserved top billing at WCW's biggest show of the year. Number 49, Lord Steven Regal vs. the Belfast Bruiser at Uncensored 1996. Uncensored 1996 was not a great show. In fact, quite the opposite. One of the sole bright spots on a rather dismal pay-per-view was a singles match between Lord Steven Regal and the Belfast Bruiser, more commonly known as Fit Finlay. The two old foes were renowned for their physicality, but both men seemed to turn things up several notches here, producing a stiff scrap that more closely resembled a UFC fight than a pro wrestling match from mid-90s WCW. For over 15 minutes, the Englishman and the Irishman used their hands, feet, elbows, knees, and other instruments of destruction to beat the ever-loving piss out of one another. The shots were so hard that Regal ended up getting busted open hard way, a big no-no in the company at the time, before the match mercifully ended via disqualification when Earl Robert Eaton and Squire David Taylor ran to the aid of his lordship. Quite unlike anything seen in a mainstream American promotion at the time, the match still holds up and still looks utterly brutal to this day. Number 48, Randy Savage vs. Diamond Dallas Page at the Great American Bash 1997. One of WCW's top feuds of 1997 was Randy Savage vs. Diamond Dallas Page, a personal grudge which resulted in 3 ultra-heated pay-per-view singles meetings between the pair. The best of the bunch is probably the one in the middle, a Falls Count Anywhere affair that was picked to close the show. The match got off to a hot start as DDP ambushed his foe from behind and the pace never let up, though Dallas himself was slowed down due to injured ribs, which played nicely into the story of the bout. After a walk through the crowd, the Macho Man took over, pile-drove WCW referee Mickey J, obviously, threw replacement referee Mark Curtis out of the ring, and looked to have things in control. But a trip to a picnic area, no really, turned the tide for Page as they continued to brawl into the ring. In the end, the New World Order numbers game made the difference, with Scott Hall's interference allowing an exhausted Savage to hit the top rope elbow drop and just barely escape with the W. Number 47, Barry Windham and Flyin' Brian vs. Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas at Starrcade 1992. WCW during the Bill Watts-led days was a lot different to the product Eric Bischoff and his team helped shape just a couple of years later. The emphasis was on the sport part of the sports entertainment package, with a talented roster of exceptional athletes typically engaging in long matches where wrestling was the story. One of the best from this period was the tag team title match from Starrcade '92, with Steamboat and Douglas defending against Pillman and Wyndham. Considering all four are great workers and they're given 20 minutes to play with, you probably expect it to be good, but what the quartet produce manages to be even better than you imagine going in. It's just classic old-school tag team wrestling, with heels against baby faces and everyone playing their parts perfectly, with the Dragons selling and comebacks in particular simply on another level. And if you don't want to see Steamboat and Douglas taking a kicking before making hot tags and comebacks, well, I just don't think we can be friends, I'm afraid. Number 46, Ciclope, Damien and La Parka versus Hector Garza, Super Calo and Juventud Guerrera on Nitro. One of the highlights of WCW during the Monday Night Wars was the influx of luchadors from Mexico. Obviously, you had the likes of Mysterio and Psychosis standing out from the pack, but there was a whole supporting cast of high-flying stars that deserve a ton of credit for bringing plenty of excitement to WCW programming. There were seemingly hundreds of singles, tag, 6-man, and even 8-man tag matches to savor, but if you want a good encapsulation of what made the division so great, look no further than this effort from the May 26, 1997 edition of Nitro. The first match of the broadcast, following a Hulk Hogan promo, the Sextet was tasked with setting the tone of the show early, and they did not need a second invitation. A brisk 6 minutes and 26 seconds of anarchy, it is a total spot fest and doesn't try and convince you otherwise, with big moves coming thick and fast, including an incredible series of dives to the outside, one of which ends up in the front row. The pro wrestling equivalent of downing a 6-pack of Red Bull, I challenge your heart rate to stay steady while watching this human car crash unfold. Number 45, Jushin Liger versus Brian Pillman at Super Brawl II. The second Super Brawl had several good matches: Rude vs Steamboat, Sting vs Luger, and a pair of tags featuring members of the Dangerous Alliance, but none could quite reach the standard set by the two men in the show's opener. Jushin Liger made his way across the Pacific Ocean to defend his WCW light heavyweight title against Flyin' Brian. A beautiful blend of crisp mat wrestling and impactful high-flying, Pillman and Luger had tremendous chemistry despite only one previous meeting in Japan, and complemented each other perfectly. It wasn't 100 miles per hour all the way through, as they paced things smartly, keeping it on the ground before taking it to the skies. The crowd, which hadn't really seen anything quite like this before, responded enthusiastically and rose to their feet when Liger unleashed an incredible somersault plancha to the floor. It may seem pretty ordinary by today's standards, but that move and other things like springboards and moonsaults just weren't commonplace 30-odd years ago, as Pillman and Liger went tit for tat during a breathless closing stretch. The prototypical hot opener, it still thrills over 3 decades later. Number 44, Eddie Guerrero versus Chris Jericho at Fall Brawl 1997. Sticking with the light heavyweights for a second, and by early 1996, the newly dubbed Cruiserweights had their own championship to fight over. Two of the very best of the bunch did just that in the curtain raiser of Fall Brawl 97. Guerrero and Jericho had both been somewhat bland babyfaces during their WCW careers to this point, and previous matches between the two had failed to ignite. With Eddie now embracing his inner heel, this effort was a lot more heated, starting a little slower on the mat before exploding into life. Guerrero was able to get on top and wear Jericho down with a series of painful submissions before the two men began trading big moves for some close near falls. After all manner of strikes, slams and suplexes, Guerrero was able to counter a superplex and hit the frog splash to bag the Cruiserweight title for the first time. This is a great back and forth match between two legends relatively early in their careers. Both men wrestled like they felt they had something to prove, and I think it's fair to say they proved it on this night. Number 43, The Great Muta and Dick Slater versus Ric Flair and Sting at Clash of the Champions 8. Sting and Ric Flair were rivals who brought out the best in each other, but what were they like as partners? Well, the answer is very good, based on the evidence of the main event of the 8th Clash of Champions, aka Fall Brawl. Any disappointment over Dick Slater taking the place of Terry Funk is eradicated early on as Sting and Muta get things off to a hot start. But really, you can't go wrong with any combination here, and Slater, who considered Terry Funk his hero and mentor, does a very good impression of the Funker with his wild bumping, selling, and facial expressions. The fans go nuts for everything Flair and Sting do, and they get plenty of time to shine before the heels isolate the Nature Boy. Soon it's Sting's turn to take a beating before Slick Rick comes in to clean house and everything starts breaking down as the ref is thrown, Sting is blinded by yellow mist, and Flair is busted open by Dirty Dick's arm cast. Amongst the chaos, Funk shows up and puts a bag over Flair's head, drawing the disqualification. So a questionable finish perhaps, but the match before that was rocking. Number 42, Ricky Steamboat vs. Rick Rude at Beach Blast 1992. The Iron Man match is a tricky beast and it takes two skilled participants to properly pull it off. Well, they don't come much more skilled than Ricky Steamboat and Rick Rude, who had the first ever televised Iron Man match at Beach Blast 1992. Ravishing Rick and the Dragon didn't exactly have a template to follow or other examples to study as they tried to score the most decisions within a half-hour period. Their pacing, psychology, and, well, everything really, was on point here, and they managed to create a ton of intrigue between the 7.5 to 10 minute mark. First, Rude scored a fall, then another, and then hit Steamboat with a top rope knee drop. That was a DQ in Bill Watts' WCW, but the former NWA heavyweight champion was so out of it that Rude was able to make things 3-1 anyway. The rest of the match saw the Dragon pull back fall after fall as he improbably made it 4-3 with 30 seconds to go. The final frantic 30 seconds are as enthralling as the first 29.5 minutes as Rude and Steamboat set the benchmark for all Iron matches that followed. Number 41, the Steiner Brothers vs. Hiroshi Hase and Masahiro Chono at Clash of the Champions 15. WCW's working relationship with New Japan resulted in some stupendous matches both stateside and in the land of the rising sun. Two men responsible for an untold number of thrillers in both countries were the awesome force of Rick and Scott Steiner. The amateur standouts seemed to be in their element when mixing up with their Japanese counterparts, such as Hiroshi Hase and a green but great Masahiro Chono. Their IWGP Tag Team title meeting at the 15th Clash of the Champions was as Smash Mouth gets, with Chono kicking Rick in the noggin so hard during an early exchange that it actually broke his headgear. As well as surly strikes, there is plenty of great teamwork, no shortage of high-impact slams and suplexes, and finally the match-winning Frankensteiner. At a fraction over 8 minutes, this is a tight, all-action affair that has the crowd lapping up every bone-crunching move and exchange. The only downside was Scott suffering a torn triceps during the post-match attack by Dick Murdoch and Dick Slater, aka the Hardliners. Beat two skilled Japanese grapplers only to get done in by some cowboy boot-wearing rednecks. Isn't that always the way? Number 40, Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Ultimo Dragon at World War III 1996. The Cruiserweight revolution was in full flow by late 1996 as the likes of Malenko and Mysterio made the division must-see TV. Ultimo Dragon joined the company not too long after Mysterio had made his own debut, losing to Rey in the Cruiserweight title opener of Hog Wild. Mysterio got him again a couple of days later on Nitro, so by the time they met at World War III, Ultimo was chomping at the bit to get one back for himself. By this point, Rey had lost the Cruiserweight title, but Dragon possessed the J-Crown of titles, which were up for grabs here. A customarily great opener, the two masked men put on one hell of a show that had great technical wrestling, plenty of flying, and some really big moves. Dragon controlled the bulk of the contest, trying in vain to keep his smaller opponent from rallying with some brutal offense. Mysterio got some offense of his own in, not a lot though, but he made it all count and created enough doubt before Ultimo retained. Number 39, Chris Benoit vs. Kevin Sullivan at the Great American Bash 1996. The feud between Kevin Sullivan and Chris Benoit was ultra-personal and at times blurred the lines between fantasy and reality. Watching them collide at the 96 Great American Bash, you couldn't be too sure a few live rounds weren't being thrown. The Crippler and the Taskmaster went hell for leather right from the off, meeting each other in the entrance aisle and laying in heavy shots before the opening bell had sounded. Not much of this Falls Count Anywhere scrap took place inside the ring, as they preferred to fight through the stands and into the men's bathroom, of all places, where Sullivan slammed a door right on Benoit's head. They eventually brawled their way back to the ring, where Benoit used a table propped up on the top turnbuckle as a launching pad for his match-winning superplex. There wasn't a whole lot to this match besides them walloping each other, but sometimes that's all you need, isn't it? Genuinely at odds behind the scenes due to personal reasons, both men kept it professional in front of the cameras and really gave viewers a taste of their genuine animosity. Extra points for the post-match angle with Arn Anderson too. Number 38, the Midnight Express versus the Southern Boys at the Great American Bash 1990. The Midnight Express, any iteration really, are one of the greatest professional wrestling tag teams of all time. There would no doubt be more of their matches on this here list had most of their best work not occurred before JCP was sold to Turner. As it is, trust me when I say that this one Midnight's match against the Southern Boys is as good as any other. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's one of the best tag matches to take place on American soil, ever. Eaton, Lane, Smothers and Armstrong put on an 18-minute masterclass at the 1990 Bash with the tag championships on the line. Southern Doubles Wrestling 101 by 4 consummate pros with added redneck kung fu, the match ebbed and flowed wonderfully, building and building to a crescendo. Really, you can only sit and marvel at the timing of the sequences, as the Express were clearly untouchable at this point when it came to the bell-to-bell stuff, and the fired-up Southern Boys were the perfect opponents for them. Credit also for managing to turn the crowd around, because they were all about cheering the supposed heels before Eaton, Lane and Cornette worked their magic. Number 37, Ric Flair vs Hulk Hogan at Bash at the Beach 1994. Say what you want about Hulk Hogan, and if you're a regular viewer, you'll know that I need no encouragement on that front, but the man was a major superstar. After leaving WWE in the summer of 1993, the Hulkster was lured over to the competition, who subsequently built the promotion around him. Their marquee signing was unveiled amid much fanfare, and his first match was booked against WCW World Heavyweight Champion Ric Flair in the main event of the 1994 Bash at the Beach. Hogan, who brought Shaquille O'Neal and Mr. T along for some added star power, would have probably been booed out of a WCW ring just a few years earlier. But this was a different, decidedly more mainstream and family-friendly WCW, and the man was over. For WCW, putting this particular match on pay-per-view was a big boon, since WWE had failed to do it when they had both men under contract just a couple of years prior. The match just felt big time, and as far as the actual action was concerned, lived up to the hype. Flair did Flair stuff and Hogan did Hogan stuff before the inevitable leg drop finish. And off to the races WCW went, brother! Number 36, Dustin Rhodes vs Vader at Clash of the Champions 29. Hulk Hogan's influence was certainly being felt by the time the 29th Clash of the Champions special aired in November of 1994. Terrible Terry's pals, Ed Leslie, John Tenter, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the Honky Tonk Man were all over the show, with Hogan headlining in a handicap match refereed by Mr. T, which he won, naturally. The promotion may have been growing increasingly cartoony, but you could always count on Big Van Vader to bring you back to reality with just a few well-placed bear paws to the face. Dustin Rhodes may have long ago cemented his status as one of the best workers of his generation, but many fans didn't quite accept Dusty's kid at the level he was being pushed at until his performance here. Vader was at his big bully best, smacking the natural around while trash-talking and even spitting at him, riling Dustin up so that he quickly gave as good as he got. Despite that flurry, Vader typically came back strong, but the grandson of a plumber managed to survive 2 Vader bombs and mount another comeback, including an incredible second rope DDT. He didn't manage the upset, but by withstanding the onslaught and fighting back, he proved to everyone watching that he was the real deal, if you will. Number 35, Sting vs Cactus Jack at Beach Blast 1992. The feeling when Mick Foley left WCW in 1994 was that his tenure in the Turner-backed company had a slight disappointment and that he could have been used a lot better. But when you look back at his work as Cactus Jack during the early 90s, you have to say that Foley's WCW career was chock full of highlights. Chief among them is this excellent Falls Count Anywhere match with Sting from Beach Blast 92. Announcer Jim Ross said it best as Cactus Jack made his entrance, noting that the masochist was more than happy to put his body on the line in order to accomplish his goals. And it only took Foley a matter of seconds to endure his first bone-jarring bump of the match as Sting gave him a back body drop on the ramp. That set the tone for what was to follow, a wild and woolly and highly inventive brawl that saw both men put their bodies on the line. This was the sort of match that the face-painted hero, who was WCW champion at the time, though the title wasn't up for grabs, needed to establish his tough guy credentials, and he walked away with not just the win, but a new level of respect. Number 34, 3 Counts versus Evan Courageous and Jamie Noble versus the Young Dragons at Starrcade 2000. For all the negatives about Vince Russo, and as has been well documented, there are a great many of them, one of his positive traits as a writer was his enthusiasm when it came to pushing new young talent. 6 of the beneficiaries of that philosophy during his ill-fated WCW tenure were Shane Helms, Shannon Moore, Evan Courageous, Jamie Noble, Kaz Hayashi, and Jimmy Yang. The sextet feuded throughout 2000 and had 2 ladder matches. The first, a 3-on-3 affair from the New Blood Rising fought over a gold record, was very good. However, this 3-team tussle from Starrcade was simply superior. With a cruiserweight title opportunity the next night on Nitro there for the taking, these fearless high flyers did everything possible to secure it and entertain the fans in the process. Is it a tad sloppy and reckless at times? Sure, but as far as balls to the wall spot fests go, they don't get much more fun or creative than this. WWE may have cornered the market on this sort of thing thanks to the exploits of Edge and Christian, the Hardys and the Dudleys, but WCW's Cruiser Crew put on something rather spectacular and gave long-suffering fans something to cheer as the company was circling the drain. Number 33, Psychosis versus Rey Mysterio Jr. at Bash at the Beach 1996. During the Monday Night War era, a pattern developed when it came to WCW pay-per-views. Though much of the mid-card might have been uninspired and the top matches were customarily reserved for NWO-based nonsense, the lower portion of the card was home to some of the most incredible, revolutionary wrestling you could see anywhere in the world, courtesy of the hard-grafting Cruiserweight division. On the night where the New World Order was formed, Rey Mysterio and Psychosis tore the house down in a superlative opener. The two were more than well acquainted with one another, having blown minds in Mexico, Japan, and in ECW, but Mysterio was still new to the WCW fans, having debuted at the prior month's Great American Bash, while Psychosis was making just his second WCW appearance, having put over Conan in a quick match 6 months beforehand. As spectacular as Mysterio was and is, Psychosis was right up there with him and deserves a ton of credit for not only throwing caution to the wind with his fearless dives and splashes, but also for being a rock-solid base for all of Rey Jr.'s sensational maneuvers. Blowing away everything else on the card as far as in-ring action was concerned with their 15-minute barn burner, Mysterio and Psychosis cemented the Luchadors as a must-see attraction. Number 32, Bret Hart vs. Chris Benoit on Nitro. On May 23, 1999, Owen Hart tragically fell to his death while waiting to perform a special entrance as the Blue Blazer during WWE's Over the Edge pay-per-view. Less than 5 months later, Owen's older brother Bret stood in the middle of a WCW ring in the same building, Kansas City's Kemper Arena, ready to wrestle a match in honor of his younger sibling. The Hitman had specifically requested a match with Benoit to pay tribute to Owen, asking WCW management for 25 minutes as well as no gimmicks or storyline shenanigans to impede proceedings. With local legend and Hart family friend Harley Race serving as ring announcer, the two Canadians proceeded to have a slow-burning throwback of a match that more closely resembled an NWA heavyweight title bout from the 70s, rather than the bonkers action fans during the Attitude Era had tuned their attention spans to. It was a masterful match from two masters of their craft, which, thankfully, the fans in attendance reserved their patience and reverence for. Clocking in at 27.5 minutes, the clinic came to a close when Hart tapped Benoit out via the sharpshooter. That said, really, a winner and loser were immaterial in the grand scheme of things. What really mattered was that they had paid tribute to Owen Hart with one of the very best matches in WCW history. Number 31, Ric Flair vs. Ricky Steamboat at Chi-Town Rumble 1989. After taking the best part of a year off following his WWE departure, Ricky Steamboat re-emerged in WCW in January of 1989 as the surprise partner of Eddie Gilbert as the two men defeated Horsemen Ric Flair and Barry Windham in a dynamite match on WCW television. The Dragon was back, and he was coming after the Nature Boy, with their first meeting scheduled for the Chi-Town Rumble a month later. The two men had put on some excellent matches years earlier, though most of those were strictly for the benefit of people lucky enough to be in the arena on the night. Now, with a pay-per-view audience eagerly watching on, Flair and Steamboat got to show the world just what they were capable of in a 5-star main event for the ages. The shortest match in what would develop into a timeless trilogy, it begins their series in the best way possible. This is two professionals at the very top of their game, doing what they do best, knowing their roles and characters, and trusting each other implicitly on every move and exchange. You can feel the chops and sense the exhaustion as the sweat flies and Steamboat writes his name in the history books by winning his first and only NWA heavyweight title. Number 30, Goldberg vs. Diamond Dallas Page at Halloween Havoc 1998. One of the big knocks on Bill Goldberg has been his perceived inability to have a compelling match that wasn't shorter than his entrance. It's all bollocks, of course, and something that the then WCW World Champion dispelled when he defended his title in the main event of Halloween Havoc 98. It helped that he was in there with DDP, a man known for plotting out his matches to the finest detail, as the two men fought for a frantic 10 minutes, a marathon in comparison to Goldberg's usual squashes. It was hard-hitting, it was intense, and it featured one of the best counter/near falls in history when Dallas reversed a jackhammer attempt into a diamond cutter. The crowd were with them the whole way because both men were really over, and Goldberg just had that special aura you could not manufacture. Those in the MGM Grand were probably also happy that they weren't watching a replay of the calamitous Hogan Warrior match from earlier in the night. Yeesh. Props to Page for carrying the load here and making himself and his opponents look like stars. And no props to WCW, who let the show overrun and ensured that the pay-per-view feed cut out for many paying customers who had to cash the main event when the company aired it on Nitro the next night for free instead. Classic WCW. Number 29, Randy Savage vs. Ric Flair at the Great American Bash 1995. While the signing of Hulk Hogan, the debut of Nitro, and the NWO angle should definitely get credit for helping turn WCW's fortunes around, a pat on the back should also be reserved for Ric Flair and Randy Savage, whose rivalry helped generate strong business for WCW on the house show circuit. The Nature Boy and the Macho Man also clashed on television and various pay-per-views during their WCW tenures, with the pick of the bunch probably being the main event of the 95 Great American Bash. With Savage fighting for his family's honor after Flair assaulted his father, Angelo Poffo, the match was more of an intense brawl than they usually had, where you could really feel Randy's hatred bubbling with every passing moment. Flair and Savage were like yin and yang, their two styles complementing each other perfectly. Give them a decent storyline, a big stage setting, and enough time to play with, and the magic just ends up working itself. It might not be on quite the same level as their WrestleMania 8 showdown from 3 years earlier, but this ably demonstrated that the two legends were still more than capable of getting it done in the ring. Woo! Dig it! Number 28, Steve Austin vs. Ricky Steamboat at Bash at the Beach 1994. It was obvious from the off that stunning Steve Austin was loaded with potential. Growing in confidence with each promo, match, and angle, Austin was the sort of up-and-coming star that WCW really should have been preparing to eventually build their company around. They didn't, much to their own detriment, and based on stunning Steve's Summer of '94 series with Ricky Steamboat, you simply have to wonder, what the hell were they thinking? Austin and the Dragon had worked with each other on countless occasions since '92, so they knew each other inside and out by the time they met with the US title on the line at the 1994 Bash at the Beach. A fiery babyface and a fast-bumping heel is always a winning combination, and there simply weren't many better at those respective roles than Austin and Steamboat. Given a generous 20 minutes to play with, these two tremendous pro wrestlers went out and put on a rip-roaring pro wrestling match that built expertly. Annoyingly, the crowd weren't especially into it for the most part, but you know what I always say, right? Balls to the crowd and balls to you, because this was textbook stuff. Number 27, Eddie Guerrero vs Shinjiro Otani at Starrcade 1995. Speaking of textbooks, everybody watching Starrcade 1995 got an education in professional wrestling thanks to the presence of some of New Japan's best and brightest. And while bouts like Jushin Liger vs Chris Benoit and Alex Wright vs Koji Kanemoto were certainly impressive, they weren't quite on the level of Eddie Guerrero's match with Shinjiro Otani. Again, their familiarity certainly didn't hurt things, as Guerrero knew Otani from his various tours of the Far East, where he primarily wrestled as Black Tiger II. On this occasion, however, he was very much maskless and working as a babyface against the Japanese invader. Not that jingoism or company affiliation reared their ugly little heads here, this was just about two of the absolute best in their style going out and rocking the house. Stiff strikes, submissions, suplexes, springboards, hurricane ranas. Eddie and Otani threw everything they had at one another and got fans invested in the outcome solely due to the strength of their exceptional work. This sort of match might have been routine in New Japan, but it hadn't really been seen in a WCW ring much at all since Pillman and Liger dropped jaws years earlier, so to say that this was a nice change of pace would be a massive understatement. The Cruiserweight revolution was imminent. Number 26, the Four Horsemen vs Brian Pillman, Sting and the Steiner brothers at Wrestle War 1991. War Games. Sorry, let me do that again. War Games! Does anyone else get that warm, fuzzy feeling reminiscing on these two-ring double cage bloodbaths? Thank the Lord for that, I thought I was a psychopath for a second there. One of the best NWA/WCW innovations, the War Games match was always something to look forward to. Many of them were genuine claret-soaked classics before the gimmick got diluted and they decided to mess with a winning formula towards the end of the 90s. The one at Wrestle War 91 was one of the very best, as the Horseman squad of Flair, Wyndham, Vicious and Zbyszko threw down with the uber babyface squad of Sting, the Steiners and Pillman. It's just non-stop action from bell to bell with something always going on somewhere. The low roof doesn't hinder either and actually plays into the match, from Pillman using it to transition into moves to Sting pressing Flair up against it. Regrettably, the roof does almost do Flying Brian in as he catches his feet on it going up for Sid's powerbomb, injuring him on the landing and bringing out El Gigante of all people to surrender the match for the good guys in what was reputedly an improvised finish. Still, that doesn't detract from what was a superior War Games and one of WCW's best matches of a fruitful decade. Number 25, Cactus Jack vs Vader at Halloween Havoc 1993. Whether they were ripping off ears on a house show in Germany or ripping it up in a pay-per-view main event, Cactus Jack and Vader always gave fans their money's worth. Embroiled in one of the most punishing rivalries in wrestling, the two men put their bodies through hell in a series of matches that stood in stark contrast to the shifting tone and tenor of WCW programming at the time. Singling out one match from the rest is really tricky, but we've spun the wheel and made a deal with their Texas Death Match from Halloween Havoc 1993. The term deathmatch can often seem, just a tad hyperbolic in wrestling, but it actually applies in this case because watching it, you genuinely worry that somebody, probably Foley, could die. It is just brutal from start to finish, with stiff strikes, sick bumps, and, to be quite frank, one too many unprotected weapon shots. It is a gutsy performance from both and a borderline uncomfortable viewing experience at times, but utterly compelling all the same. A stun gun finish and the match not being for the WCW title, despite the champion winning, is classic WCW, of course. Number 24, Rey Mysterio Jr. vs Dean Malenko at the Great American Bash 1996. There's a good story behind Rey Mysterio Jr.'s WCW debut. The masked man, who had taken Mexico, Japan, and ECW by storm, showed up at the Baltimore Arena unaware that he would be in a championship match on pay-per-view, having assumed that he was booked for a non-televised house show. The rest of the WCW locker room instantly took to mocking the undersized luchador behind his back, but when Rey came through the curtain after his loss to Dean Malenko, the naysayers were giving him a rare standing ovation for his eye-opening performance. Having the Iceman as a dance partner was obviously advantageous to the so-called King of Mystery, but the then 21-year-old deserved the plaudits for a showing that well and truly put him on the map. The match was an exquisite mesh of styles, with Mysterio's flying and Malenko's more mat-based approach providing an intriguing dichotomy. The two would arguably have even better matches further down the line, but for historical importance, and because, it's still well in that upper tier, Mysterio vs Malenko from the 96 Great American Bash deserves your attention. Number 23, Raven vs Diamond Dallas Page vs Chris Benoit at Uncensored 1998. You couldn't pick 3 more different wrestlers, could you? Well, you probably could, but you have to admit there is a stark contrast here, no? You've got Raven, the extremist with a penchant for weapons-based violence. You got Diamond Dallas Page, the late starter who worked hard and polarized colleagues by mapping out his matches to the nth detail. And then you've got Chris Benoit, the hard-hitting dojo-trained machine who favored the Japanese strong style. Putting the 3 of them out there in a no DQ Falls Count Anywhere match for the US title could have been a recipe for disaster, but turned out to be one of the best triple threats you'll likely ever see. I mean, any match that starts with a 3-man lockup is going to be good, isn't it? That is about as scientific as the match gets, mind, as the trio proceed to beat the hell out of each other with weapons, the stage set, and anything else they can get their hands on for the rest of it. 3-ways were a relatively new concept at this point, but Raven, Page, and Benoit had no issues coming up with all manner of novel moves and sequences involving all of them. A second rope diamond cutter onto a table was a suitably badass ending to a chaotic contest. Number 22, Ric Flair vs Lex Luger at Starrcade 1988. A big criticism of Lex Luger was that he never put in a proper amount of effort and failed to live up to his seemingly limitless potential. That may be true to a degree, but when he was motivated and in there with the right opponent, the results were often spectacular. I mean, Luger had a certified banger with Dan Spivey, for tit's sake. One man who continually brought the best out of the total package was Ric Flair, the two having several tremendous matches over the world title. As the more experienced veteran, not to mention the heel and reigning world champion, Flair naturally led this particular match, helping to pace a pay-per-view main event that was booked to go 30 minutes. And he paced it wonderfully, with both men trading the advantage and playing to their strengths. Rick is the crafty villain, taking shortcuts when he sees them while lighting up Lex with knife-edge chops and trying to work over body parts, while Luger bounces Flair around with slams and other high-impact moves while looking like a Greek god. The finish is bloody great too, as Luger's leg buckles while he has Flair up in the torture rack, with the dirtiest player in the game falling on top and then using the ropes for leverage to retain. Number 21, Blitzkrieg vs Juventud Guerrera at Spring Stampede 1999. WCW's slide was already in motion by the time Spring Stampede 99 rolled around, but there were still positives to be found. The Cruiserweights were still good value, of course, including a new masked sensation called Blitzkrieg. He wasn't around for long and decided to quit the business for good after leaving WCW, but he managed to make quite the impression during his short time in the squared circle. Blitzkrieg was at his show-stealing best when going up against Juventud Guerrera in this frenetic curtain raiser. This was just two guys going out there and seizing the moment by showing everyone that though they may not have been given interesting storylines or angles, they are as exciting as anything on television when that bell rings. There are dives and top rope moves aplenty, with fans biting on every 2 count and spurring them on as they try to one-up each other. Eventually, the juice unleashes something that simply cannot be one-upped: a middle rope hoovy driver. Follow that. Number 20, the Steiner brothers vs Sting and Lex Luger at Super Brawl 1. Some all-babyface encounters can suffer from a lack of crowd heat due to the fans in the arena not knowing exactly who they're supposed to be cheering for. Not in this match though, oh no. Because when these 4 studs got together at the first Super Brawl and spent 11 minutes hossing each other about for fun, the 6,000 in Florida's Bayfront Center had no issues cheering them all on wildly. There's no easing into things with these two teams as they go full throttle right away, with Luger throwing Rick around at will before Sting comes in and hits a ludicrous over-the-top rope plancher. When Scotty tags in, things get taken up a notch further as he never needed an excuse to throw or suplex someone around and did so gleefully as the contest romped on. The fans are popping for everything as they continue to empty their arsenals without taking a moment for a breather. It wasn't perfect and the interference-based finish does take away some of the shine, but this is an explosive tag team title match that makes up for having fans suffer through Big Josh, the Great and Powerful Oz, and El Gigante earlier in the show. Number 19, Scott Steiner vs. Goldberg at Fall Brawl 2000. Sticking with Scott Steiner, and what a transformation Ric's younger brother made towards the end of the 90s. Branching out as a solo star, Big Papa Pump changed up his look, attitude, and wrestling style to become a bona fide main eventer. He may have been a bit more limited and broken down by the time he was in the World Heavyweight title mix, but he had a natural, intimidating aura that made suspension of disbelief easy, something his opponent at Fall Brawl 2000 had in spades too. Steiner and Goldberg clashed in the no DQ pay-per-view semi-main event, and let me tell you, there was no feeling out process to ease them into it. This was two bulls, two absolute monsters, smashing into each other and hoping the other man didn't get up. But they did keep getting up, shrugging off the clotheslines and power slams and the suplexes, with Goldberg fighting through blood loss. The match is much better before Vince Russo and Medeja get involved, with the numbers game eventually catching up to the man, but it is still a hellacious brawl and a diamond in the rough from WCW's dying days. Number 18, Arn Anderson and Larry Zbyszko vs. Ricky Steamboat and Dustin Rhodes at Clash of the Champions 17. Barry Windham was supposed to team with Dustin Rhodes against WCW Tag Team Champions Zbyszko and Anderson, aka the Enforcers, at the 17th Clash of the Champions. Unfortunately, Big Baz was having a bit of hand trouble, kayfabe and IRL, so a mystery replacement partner was enlisted. These things are typically letdowns, but the reveal of Ricky Steamboat just weeks after leaving WWE following a forgettable run there was done perfectly. As for the match, well, it's just about as good a tag bout as you're likely to see, with four pros working the formula expertly and building the anticipation for those hot tags. The heat segment on Steamboat, stuffed with tremendous selling and tantalizing hope spots, is particularly great. But the whole match flies by and it gives fans a taste of the great worker that Rhodes would eventually become. Anderson and Zbyszko are the proverbial well-oiled machine, holding everything together and dictating the pace, before the feel-good finale as the Dragon gets the pin and wins gold on his first night back in the promotion he always looked more at home in. Number 17, Ric Flair vs. Sting at the Great American Bash 1990. After Ric Flair put him on the map with a sterling 45-minute draw at the very first Clash of the Champions special, there was really no stopping Sting's ascent to the top. With his thick tan, blonde flat top, face paint and colourful costumes, the Stinger looked like a cartoon character come to life and was primed to be WCW's #1 babyface of the 90s. He would have won his first NWA World's Heavyweight title at Wrestle War 1990 had he not blown his knee out in the build-up. Some in WCW wanted to go with Luger instead, but Flair stuck to his word and a handshake agreement to drop the belt to Sting, with the two finally set to meet at the Great American Bash. Flair vs. Sting was another one of those eminently enjoyable combinations that just worked, and it's a good thing that they didn't put the belt on Luger at this time because fans clearly wanted Sting to win it. It's a great match, one of many between these two, going about 16 minutes and ending with Sting countering a figure 4 into an inside cradle to bag his first NWA World's Heavyweight title and end Slick Ric's 400-plus day reign. Number 16, Vader vs. Ron Simmons on WCW Main Event. The emotion displayed when Sting beat Flair at the 1990 Great American Bash was something to behold, but the reaction Ron Simmons received when he pinned Vader to become the first African-American WCW champ in history was something else entirely. The call to make the switch was done by then-booker Bill Watts, who had enjoyed much success in his Mid-South territory, with Junkyard Dog working on top of the card. Ron's big moment would have been nice had it come on pay-per-view after a decent build-up, but it also works really well because it pretty much comes out of nowhere and the audience think they're just watching a routine defense at a house show. The match was later aired on WCW Main Event, of course. Simmons, for his part, steps up his game against the champ and they had a competitive 10-minute bout. But this is much more about the destination than the journey, and Ron's win was historic, not to mention euphoric for those in attendance. For anyone who says wins and losses don't matter in wrestling, I dare you to say the same after witnessing the reaction to this history-making title change. Number 15, Ric Flair versus Ricky Steamboat at Clash of the Champions 6. Yeah, we know we said we would try and limit match pairing so that the list wasn't flooded with rematches and there was more variety. But this is Flair versus Steamboat we're talking about here, and you really can't discuss one match and not the other two from the trilogy. Slick Rick attempted to regain his title from the Dragon in a 2 out of 3 falls match at the 6th Clash of the Champions. Where their Chi-Town Rumble meeting was shorter and perhaps fierier, this one is the longest of the bunch, more deliberate in its pacing and telling a different story due to the stipulation. The work is obviously first rate, and the match sits high on the list that aspiring wrestlers should probably study if they want to even be half decent at the graps. Study the technique all you want, but you can't teach the sort of stamina Flair and Steamboat had, and they cut a faster pace than you would assume given the match's length. There aren't too many wrestlers in history who could wrestle a match as long and as intense as this one with this particular stipulation and make it this good. But then there aren't too many wrestlers in history quite like Flair and Steamboat, and to some people this remains the greatest professional wrestling match in history. Not WCW history, wrestling history. Period. Number 14, Dean Malenko versus Ultimo Dragon at Starrcade 1996. Though he was the second man to hold the belts, Dean Malenko was the first proper Cruiserweight champion. The Man of 1,000 Holds was also one of WCW's MVPs of 1996, having great matches with a wide variety of opponents from around the world. Not many were better than his Starrcade outing with Ultimo Dragon, which was not only for the Cruiserweight title, but for Dragon's J-Crown of titles too. When you talk about wrestling as an art form, Malenko and Ultimo may as well have been Rembrandt and Picasso, using the ring mat as the canvas on which to paint their masterpieces. Opening Starrcade in some style, their title versus title match began with some lovely technical wrestling before the dives and suplexes and pile drivers and whatnot came out. One thing that sets this one apart from other Cruiserweight title matches from the time is that the crowd are really into it, reacting to every big move and near fall. After 18.5 minutes of cutting-edge combat, it's the Dragon that shades it thanks to a tiger suplex. But really, we're all winners here, aren't we? Well, maybe except Dean Malenko. Number 13, Cactus Jack and Max Payne versus the Nasty Boys at Spring Stampede 1994. It may look tame some, 30 years after the fact, but the tag team street fight between the Nasty Boys and Cactus Jack and Max Payne was revolutionary at the time. Besides, where else are you going to see Max Payne in a list of must-watch matches, you know? Back in '94, stuff like brawling throughout the arena and using weapons and breaking tables wasn't exactly the done thing outside of a designated high spot, so seeing these 4 big lads do nothing but that for 9 minutes was eye-opening indeed. The key to it being successful was the intensity and conviction behind everything they did. Even the spot where a table broke under the weight of sags and Foley doesn't slow things down but rather speeds things up adds to the chaos of the whole thing. That botch is followed up by one of the sickest bumps Foley ever took, and consider the competition there for a second, which mercifully ends things. After a shovel shot to the head, of course. Can't forget the old shovel shot now, can we? Number 12, Cactus Jack and Kevin Sullivan versus the Nasty Boys at Slamboree 1994. Deja vu all over again, with Cactus Jack swapping Max Payne for Kevin Sullivan as he seeks revenge against those darn Nasty Boys in a Broad Street Bully match. That is basically a Falls Count Anywhere match for the confused among you. It was just called that because hockey legend Dave Schultz, aka the Broad Street Bully, was serving as special guest referee. The match is about as pretty as the 4 men involved, though Foley was an admittedly handsome fellow in his younger days as they set about lamping each other with chairs and trash cans from the word go. And yeah, I mean, they do that for quite a while, as well as punching each other hard in the face while Foley takes some of his trademark crazy bumps. As always with these sorts of bar fight type matches, the fan reaction helps a lot as the Philadelphia faithful are into every crash, bang and wallop. What a video. It has a very satisfying conclusion too, as Jack finally beats Sags before Max Payne and Dave Sullivan come out to pay off the broader storyline. Number 11, Hulk Hogan versus Goldberg on Nitro. Bit of a famous one this. Right, so the July 6th, 1998 episode of WCW Nitro took place in the Georgia Dome and was headlined by the red-hot Bill Goldberg challenging Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World title. The Monday Night Wars were very much in full flow at this point, with WWE's own ass-kicking bald dude with a goatee doing his damnedest to turn the tide in Vince McMahon's favour. Some have argued that putting Hogan vs Goldberg on free television was a boneheaded move that likely cost the company millions of dollars in pay-per-view revenue. But this was the right time and the right place for the former Atlanta Falcon to win the big gold belt for the first time. The match is pretty much as basic as you can get, but it didn't have to be anything else because the crowd were positively molten for all of it. The end result and the insane reaction to it also adds credence to the theory that the Hulkster shouldn't have done many jobs because it really did mean something when he was beaten as he was here, clean as a whistle to boot. Number 10, Sting vs Big Van Vader at Starrcade 1992. Sting and Vader had many great rivalries and matches with other opponents during the early to mid-90s, as evidenced by their repeated appearances on this here list. But both men were at their very best when squaring off with one another. The ultimate David versus Goliath rivalry, it was always a treat to see these two lock up, and they had a seriously excellent series of matches on pay-per-view. The peak, in the opinion of many, was their King of Cable tournament final match from Starrcade 92. It doesn't matter what King of Cable is, I don't think anybody really knew at the time either. What matters is watching the big bastard beat up the smaller guy, who valiantly won't quit but comes back with everything he's got time and time again, trying to break down the super heavyweight with his explosive offense. You can't help but get sucked into the narrative as Sting gets his backside kicked and sells like there's no tomorrow, the action as violent and realistic as anything in mainstream American wrestling at the time. It tells a great story and has a clever finish too, as Vader makes one major mistake and opens the door for the Stinger to become the King of Cable, whatever the hell that is. Number 9, Johnny B. Bad vs Brian Pillman at Fall Brawl 1995. The first question you might ask here is, who the hell thought it was a good idea to give Johnny B. Bad and Brian Pillman 30 whole goddamn minutes to open a pay-per-view? The second question you'll probably ask is, how the hell is a 30-minute match between Johnny B. Bad and Brian Pillman so freaking good? The answer to the first question is that nobody thought it would be a good idea. On the contrary, the match was booked to go half an hour as a way to expose both performers as not being as good as people thought they were. Well, that certainly backfired because it turned out to be the best bloody match on the show. WCW always failing upwards. Rather than panic or buckle under the pressure, the loose cannon and the Little Richard impersonator came up trumps by piecing together a match that gradually drew viewers in as it went along. Though both men were ostensibly babyfaces looking to become #1 contender to Sting's US title, Pillman got progressively more heelish as the match went on and into sudden death overtime, where Bad just about shaded it. Number 8, Ric Flair vs Terry Funk at Clash of the Champions 9. WCW were on such a hot streak in 1989, thanks in large part to the efforts of Ric Flair. The dirtiest player in the game was the company's MVP that year, having a vaunted trilogy of matches with Ricky Steamboat, as well as great matches with the likes of Sting, Lex Luger, and others. He also had 2 superb matches with Terry Funk. Their first at the Great American Bash was exceptional. Their second at the 9th Clash of the Champions, somehow even better. Contested under I Quit rules, this was very different to Flair's usual, more scientific bouts. After so many years of playing the villain, he had no issues switching things up and being a fiery babyface in this stiff war with the Funker. While later I Quit matches became known for the implementation of plunder and big bumps, this one is just a full-on brawl with 2 guys who know exactly who and what they are and know how to pace and structure a match as well as anyone. As a blow-off to their feud, it is perfect too, as the bad guy gets his just desserts and Flair actually wins a match with the figure 4 leg lock for once. As per the pre-match stipulations, Funk never wrestled again. Number 7, Ricky Steamboat vs Lex Luger at the Great American Bash 1989. While Flair swiftly transitioned into a rivalry with Funk immediately after the Steamboat series, the Dragon went after United States champion Lex Luger, who had not long before turned heel on him. As a bad guy, Lex was really starting to hit his stride, getting what was a planned no DQ match changed to a standard affair after throwing a hissy fit and refusing to defend his title unless WCW acquiesced. Remember that thing I said earlier about Luger being really ruddy good when he was motivated and or in there with the right opponent? Well, both of those things were happening at the '89 Great American Bash as he rose to Ricky's level and had one of the best matches of his career. It's just non-stop action for the near 11-minute duration configuration, with Steamboat shining as the consummate babyface and throwing everything at the cocky powerhouse, as they used both rings which were there for the War Games match that followed them. The finish was a clever one too, as Steamboat's frustration got the better of him and he ended up twatting the total package with a chair, drawing the disqualification, thus vindicating Luger's efforts to get the no DQ stips removed. Number 6, The Outsiders vs Sting, Randy Savage and Lex Luger at Bash at the Beach 1996. The arrival of The Outsiders, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, helped give WCW a much-needed boost and made the product seem edgy in the spring and summer of 1996. Portraying invading forces, the former Diesel and Razor Ramon promised to reveal who the third man in their group was at the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view. Their handicap bout against the babyface trio of Sting, Savage and Luger was, to be blunt, nothing particularly special as far as the in-ring work was concerned. It was alright, it was fine, it did what it needed to do. But the match's finish and the post-match angle and promo helped change the wrestling business forever. That's because this was where Hulk Hogan showed his true colours and traded in his red and yellow for black and white for life. The sight of the Hulkster, by all appearances coming to the aid of Sting and Savage after Luger had been taken out of the match injured, only to drop the big leg on the Macho Man, was like a sports entertainment atomic bomb going off in Daytona Beach, brother! As the ring filled with debris and an irate fan trying his luck, the NWO was formed and WCW entered a new era in their history. Number 5, The Steiner Brothers vs Tatsumi Fujinami and Takayuki Iizuka at WrestleWar 1992. Alright then, you twisted my arm. Here's one more match between the Steiner brothers and Japanese opposition, okay? Well, if you insist. We've already established that Rick and Scott were a total and utter force of nature in their pomp and could produce pro wrestling gold when in there with like-minded opposition. The team of respected veteran Tatsumi Fujinami and then young boy Takayuki Iizuka were the unfortunate souls on the receiving end of Scott and Rick's ceaseless onslaught, but they just kept coming back for more in a near 20-minute match that never dulled. As the rookie, Iizuka in particular took some serious bumps, but showed great fighting spirit and really made himself stand out as one to watch in the future. Those neon pink trunks also made him stand out, you have to say. Just a wonderful deal here, and the sort of match you would usually only see taking place inside the Tokyo Dome, but thanks to WCW, Western fans got easy access to. You might wince at some of the real-time dues that Iizuka pays at the hands of the Steiners, but you cannot deny it's an engrossing match. Number 4, Barry Windham vs Too Cold Scorpio at Clash of the Champions 23. Barry Windham on his day could be one of the most must-watch performers in the wrestling business. Unfortunately, he never quite reached the heights most predicted for him, despite having a stellar career by any measure. Too Cold Scorpio was one of the most spectacular and innovative performers in the business during his prime, but crashed into the glass ceiling and never really got to that next level for a variety of reasons. Putting the two together in a singles match at the 23rd Clash of the Champions could have produced some truly underwhelming results. Well, consider me surprisingly, whelmed, I guess, because these two were cooking during their NWA World Title bout. It started a little slow after Michael Buffer made his WCW debut as the announcer for major title matches, but really picked up towards the end, with Scorpio busting out some proper state-of-the-art stuff for a series of gripping near falls. While nobody ever doubted Too Cold's talents, this match proved that he could hang with a top guy in a title match setting. The result was never really in doubt, but they did have fans second-guessing themselves for a second there. Number 3, Eddie Guerrero vs Rey Mysterio Jr. at Halloween Havoc 1997. Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio could probably have a good match with each other in their sleep. But on a major stage setting with a title and Mysterio's mask on the line, forget about it. Nobody else on the card stood a chance. Before the bell rang at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, Mysterio was a ball of nerves because Eric Bischoff had been telling him for days that the creative direction called for Eddie to win and thus for Rey to lose his mask. Just before they went out, however, Eazy-E changed his mind, allowing Mysterio to relax and put on one of the best matches of his life against one of his favoured opponents. Things get going in an instant, with Mysterio flying around the ring and Guerrero basing for all his moves, many of which Rey had never done before. Eddie continually tries to ground his opponent with powerful slams and suplexes and painful submission holds and strikes, but Mysterio keeps rallying and unleashes yet more never-before-seen offense, including a springboard moonsault DDT that was, according to Rey, a happy accident. The match just builds brilliantly and the fans in Las Vegas are right there with them until the end, where Mysterio counters a Splash Mountain Bomb into a Rana to take the title and keep his mask. Flawless. Number 2, Sting Squadron vs. The Dangerous Alliance at Wrestle War 1992. The best War Games match from the post-NWO days was undoubtedly the one between Sting Squadron and the Dangerous Alliance from Wrestle War 92. I mean, just look at the lineup of talent on display here. Sting, Ricky Steamboat, Dustin Rhodes, Barry Windham, Nikita Koloff, Rick Rude, Steve Austin, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko, and Arn Anderson. An absolute embarrassment of spandex-clad riches, I'm sure you'll agree. The blood flows early as Windham and Austin start things off hot and heavy, and things only get hotter and heavier as the combatants enter the fray, the crowd's anticipation growing as the match wears on and settles into a regular rhythm of the heels gaining the advantage only for a babyface to come in and clean house. It really isn't rocket science, is it? But it works like a charm, and it helps that the 10 men involved are talented enough and the crowd is hot enough for everything they do to be maximised. This was also the right time for the babyface crew to go over and really start to wind down the Dangerous Alliance as Paulie's goons get their comeuppance in the most glorious and violent way possible. Number 1, Ric Flair vs. Ricky Steamboat at Wrestle War 1989. And we wrap things up with another snowflake-laden 1989 encounter between the peanut butter and jelly of wrestling. Their series came to a glowing conclusion at Wrestle War 89, with Flair getting his final shot at the NWA World's Heavyweight title. This one was much more of a knockdown drag-out than the previous two, and you really get a sense of the former champ's desperation as he's pinballed around by the Dragon, who really lays in the heavy leather in the form of those bruising chops. Not that Flair is any slouch, of course, and he gives as good as he gets, even if he struggles to gain any real momentum in the early going. After a topsy-turvy back-and-forth 30-plus minutes, Flair is able to cradle Steamboat on a slam attempt and win the title in the same way Ricky beat Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3. It is a fitting end to an epic trilogy for the ages, one that is still held up as the gold standard some 30-odd years after the fact. It hasn't aged badly, it's still compelling, and the post-match angle with Flair and Terry Funk is still one of the best examples of how to end one feud and start off another strong in the space of mere minutes. Being a WCW supporter could be frustrating at the best of times, but when it was this good, there was simply nothing better.